Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Ayin Gimel. We're in the beginning of the 7th chapter, and we talked about all the Menachot, that the Kometz is taken out, the handful, and the remainder go to the Kohanim. Then the Gemara had said, what is the source for this? And then they said, what do you mean? The source for it is quite obvious. And they said, okay, we meant according to Rabbi Shimon, who has an exception to the rule and says the Mincha Chote of the Kohanim. Actually, the Kometz is taken out, but both the Kometz and the Shirayim are burnt. So according to him, maybe you would think an exception, maybe you would need a special pasuk to teach you, which wouldn't have been included normally, for the barley offerings. And then the Gemara says, okay, we have an answer. Chizkiah learns it from this pasuk. Any mincha b'lula b'shem ben chariva l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. It's this additional pasuk in chapter 7 of Vayikra, this week's parsha, telling us any mincha which is mixed with oil or is dry is going to go to Aharon. To which the Gemara said, okay, that's very nice. You think, now, how did they get it? From an imeno inyam. Well, there's no reason to tell us by chitim, because we already saw the psukim. By the wheat offerings, it must be coming to tell us about the barley offerings. So now the Gemara says, that sounds very nice, except, last line of Ayin Bet Amud Bet, is it really coming for that? Don't we need it for the following braita? How do you know? Now, the way it works, before we get to reading this braita, let's explain the background. Kohanim split up into 24 groups. Every week, a different mishmar was on. You had 2 weeks a year that you were on, plus the chagim when everybody came. Now, when you were on for that week, they would take all the menachot and all the sacrifices, animal, bird, everything. Everything would be divided by the Kohanim working that week. So now, if you're working that week, and then you get your portion, how do you know that, let's say, you're a vegetarian, and you don't want the meat? You want the mincha offering, or you just want more mincha than meat, or more meat than mincha. How do you know you can't swap with another kohen? You get what you get, and that's it. You can't trade. So how do you know that? That's what it means. How do you know you can't trade a mincha for a zevach? To which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, v'chol mincha. Okay, we're going to start darshaning this pasuk. We haven't yet gotten to ours, because what we're going to darshan now, maybe I should read the pasuk in advance. So we're going to darshan Vayikra Zayim psukim 9 and 10. Both of them seem to be saying the same thing over and over again, which is, Kol mincha asher tefeh batanur, any mincha baked in the oven. V'chol naseh b'mercheshev al machvad, and the one in the deep pan or the flat pan. L'kohen hamakriv oto lo tiyeh, it goes to the kohen. V'chol mincha b'lula b'shemen, and anyone mixed with oil. V'chareva, or dry. L'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh, ish kachiv. We're going to darshan all the words in this pasuk and say, why did it repeat it so many times? Why didn't it just say, all the menachot go to, or these menachot, or something? Okay, but it listed each one separately. There's going to be a reason for each one. We're going to darshan something. And eventually we're going to get to the end of that pasuk, the part about kol mincha b'lula b'shem b'charevan. We're going to see that we learned something completely different, and then we're going to say, how can we learn what we just did? How can it be the source that the barley offerings, in the barley offerings, also the kohen get the remainder when we need it for something else entirely? So let's keep reading. So now they're going to say, from there we learn, this all goes to Aharon, that comes to teach you, you're going to get the mincha and you can't trade it for anything else. What we're basically going to say is each phrase in this pasuk is really unnecessary, and it must be coming to teach something additional. Okay, so now you'll say, fine. So menachot and zvachim you can't switch. Because why? If you're poor, you don't trade an animal for a mincha. You trade an animal for a bird, or a bird for a mincha, but you never trade an animal for a mincha. Okay, you don't go from one level to the other. But maybe you think, since in a poor person's offering you can switch, instead of bringing birds, you can bring a mincha offering. So, right, remember, there's all the sliding scale offering, which is the mincha chote, which if you're very wealthy, you bring an animal. Otherwise, you swap you swap the animal and you bring birds, or you swap the birds and you bring a mincha. And same thing with mitzora and a woman who gives birth. There's always a switch. There's 2 levels, whether, right, they're always a little different, the switch, or sometimes a little different, but there's a switch if you can't afford it. So, they're now going to say, but maybe menachot can be swapped for birds, because maybe a kohen can swap a mincha for a bird, because, like, you like the birds, I like the mincha, let's trade. Because look, you can see that they can be replaced. They can replace each other if you're poor. Now, again, these are 2 different categories. One is, can the kohen switch the portion they get after they bring the offerings and the remainders of them, or the bird offerings that are given to the kohanim to eat, versus, we're learning it from a case of the remainder. The owner can't afford, they bring a different type of korban. But the assumption is if the owner could trade it, then the kohanim should be able to switch it also. So now they quote the marcheshet. It started with the ones baked in the oven. Now they move to the marcheshet one. So now we say fine. So now we have the second pasuk, which is just can't swap a mincha with a bird. Now you might say, because look, one has blood and one doesn't have blood, so maybe that's why. But maybe birds and animals could be swapped by the kohanim. Because they're both types of blood offerings. They quote the next section, which is the machvat. Okay, so again, started with ma'afet tanur, then the marcheshet, then the machvat. Why does it say all of these separately? One, to teach you can't swap a mincha with an animal. Second, teach you can't swap a mincha with a bird. Third is teach you can't swap meat and bird offerings. Again, this is the kohanim can't swap them with each other. Fine, I get maybe birds and animals based on that pasuk because the animal is killed with a knife, which is a vessel, whereas the bird is killed with the finger of the kohen. So maybe they're different. But what's very similar? But the mincha is done by hand. It's not done in a particular vessel. So maybe the mincha, you would think, would be able to be swapped. Talmud Lomal, right? You could swap a mincha with a mincha because they're both very similar and they're both done by hand. Talmud Lomar, v'chol mincha blula b'shemen l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. Here we have it. That's what we're learning from our pasuk. Any mincha blula b'shemen l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. You get it and you can't trade. Okay, not tradable. So now they say, wait a minute. You might have thought we're not going to be able to trade birds for animals because the birds are done with the finger, melika, whereas the animals are killed with vessel with a knife. But maybe mincha and mincha could be swapped for each other, because both are done by hand, meaning taking the komets out is done by hand, the handful. Talmud Lamal, v'chol mincha b'la b'shem and l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh. Now we get to our pasuk, right? Every mincha b'la b'shem and l'chol b'nei Aaron, it's an additional. That's teach you this additional halacha. You can't swap mincha for mincha. Okay, so now you have, that's really why we got here for this one line. Because this pasuk is used for a different drasha. And that's going to be a problem. How can we use it for original drasha to say the shirayim go to the Kohen? So let's keep going though. Yacholo yichleku machva keneged marcheshet, marcheshet keneged machva. So now you say, fine, mincha can't be swapped. We learned that from that pasuk we just had. But maybe you can't swap two different kinds of minchas who have a different texture to them. The marcheshet is deep, so it makes a soft mincha, whereas the one that's flat, the machva, makes a harder one. But let's say we divided up all the marcheshets that were given on that day, and everyone got 2 pieces of Reuven's and 2 pieces of Shimon's and 2 pieces of Chanah's and whatever it might be. And then you wanted to switch, or 1 piece, I guess. Everyone gets 1 piece. And then you wanted to switch and take 2 of that one and 1 of the other, right? Or 2 of that one and none of the other. You can't do that either, even though they're done the exact same way. How do we know that? Because it said, and then after it said, and dry, right? The liquid ones and the dry ones. The extra word again comes to teach you even menachot that are exactly the same can't be swapped for each other. You might have thought, listen, all this talk about mincha and it's all learned from a pasuk about mincha. Minchas are all kodesh kodshim, but maybe they can swap kodshim kalim, to which they learn. Right? Remember, some of the parts of the kodshim kalim go to the kohen. Talmud Lomar ish ka'achiv. V'im al toda. So now the pasuk ends with ish ka'achiv, which is at the end of that pasuk. 2 psukim later, the next pasuk is about the shlamim, but the pasuk after says v'im al toda. And a toda is always, a shlamim could be kochim, and that's just in one unique case of the she'alechem. But they want to learn from the toda, which is always kochim kalim, and they're going to say, so the smichut parshiot, the fact that these are right next to each other, kashem shein cholkim b'kochim kach in cholkim b'kochim kalim. Okay, so just like you don't trade in Kodesh Kodeshim. You also can't trade Kodesh Kala. Whatever we darshan for this pasuk is true also for the Toda, which is right nearby. Ish, okay, we're still going on with this pasuk. Ish ka'achiv, the Kohanim get a portion, and it says each man like his brother. What do we learn from this? Ish cholek va'afilu bal mum, ve'en katan cholek va'afilu tam. A grown-up Kohen gets a portion, but a minor Kohen does not get a portion. And even if, now, a grown-up gets a portion, even if they're blemished. That's the interesting part. We've learned this before. I think it was in Zvachim, where the Ish, the grown-up Kohen gets, even if they're blemished, and they can't do the avoda, they still get a portion. But minors, even if they're not blemished, never get a portion. Okay, we don't divide them up to the minors, among the minors. So now, that's the end of that Braita. So again, the question for that Braita was really singular question, which is, if you're going to learn it from that pasuk, Kol mincha b'lula b'Hashem and l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyeh will teach you that you can't have mincha, you can't swap your mincha for another mincha. Well, how are we going to learn then the source for the fact that the Kohanim get the remainder in the barley offerings according to Rabbi Shimon? To which we answer, Hahu mi kol nafka. Okay, so the word kol is used. Okay, now it's a good question, but probably they're saying Rabbi Shimon darshans it from kol, because this drasha was really learning it from each one. The Belula B'Shemen and then the Chareva was teaching you another thing, that even if they were different types of menacha, you still can't, right? They're similar types of menacha, you still can't trade them. Anyway, the point being, the Rabbi Shimon drasha comes from Vikol, all minchas. Okay, all minchas are similar in the sense that even the barley ones are going to go to the Kohanim. So we use different words, and in that way we're able to get to two different drashot. Now the Gemara says, but wait, there's a third drasha we learn from this pasuk. How could we learn three things? Okay, maybe two. You could say different words, but what about this one? Okay, you might remember this. We already used this for Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. What did he darshan from here? He darshan that kol here was to say, if you remember the rikikim and the chalot. Can you divide rikikim and chalot? Can you say 5 of one and 5 of the other? And in the end they said, look at this. It says kol machvat, kol marcheshet, kol ma'afet tanor. It really starts ma'afet tanor, but the ma'afet tanor is like the marcheshet, like the machvat. It's like the chareva, it's like the blula. All those, it's only one type. You can't mix chareva and blula, dry and ones with oil. And you can't mix machvat and marcheshet. So likewise, you can't mix. So how can you learn it? A third thing from there. Maybe 2, you could say different words, to which the Gemara has an easy answer. Ela hayimi v'chol. That comes from the vav. The fact is, it says and all, and all, and all. That connected all these phrases to say that the same halacha applies for all of them, in which case we end up learning 3 different things from that pasuk, and it's all okay because we learn them from different sections, right, of different words within that, or different parts of words within that. Okay, so what we did so far is we took this minal, and where do we get it from? The Kohanim get the remainder in the barley offerings, according to Rabbi Shimon. We explained the source for it. Then we said, but that source is used for something else. And then it's even used for something else. In the end, we say all 3 exist. Now Ravina is going to bring a different source for the basic halacha about that the Kohanim get the remainder in the barley offerings. Ravina Amar, and for this we're going to get into another whole long Braita. Ravina Amar, Achemi Detani Levi. We're going to get it from the Braita that Levi brings. Detani Levi. L'chol korbanam, l'chol minchatam, l'chol chatatam, l'chol hashamam. Okay, let's read the whole pasuk. Okay, because we're going to darshan different parts of this. This is in Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 9. Yud Chet Tet. Now, this is a separate section talking about what gifts the Kohanim get. It's a section all about the things that go to the Kohanim. They're called matnot kihuna. That's why I translate them literally as gifts, but it's things we give to the Kohanim. Now, this is what you're going to get from the high sanctity level offerings. Min ha'esh, from the fire. Remember that word, okay? It sounds like from things that go on the fire. Kol korbanam l'chol minchatam l'chol chatatam l'chol hashamam. Again, we have this long list of a lot of things. All their korbanot, all their menachot, their meal offerings, all their sin offerings, all their guilt offerings. Asher yashivu li, which is also going to be something additional. It's not so clear. Which they return to me. That's not so clear what that means. And then it finishes with Kodesh Kodeshim Lecha Hu Levanecha. This will be high-level sanctity items for you and your sons. Okay, so let's start darshan. L'chol korbanam, l'chol minchatam, l'chol chatatam, l'chol hashamam. First, we're going to darshan these 4 parts of the pasuk. Kol korbanam, l'rabot log shemen shel metzora. All your korbanot, you're going to get parts of all the korbanot. What does that include? the log shemen of the log of oil of the mitzorah. If you remember the leper, they take a log of oil, and then they put it in the hands of the Kohen, and the Kohen takes from the handful of it and puts it toward the parochet, then on the ear and the finger and the toe of the leper, and then the remainder on his hand goes on the head of the leper, but everything left from that log that didn't go into the handful is given to the Kohen. So now, each time we're going to have to say, why do we need a special drasha for this? Isn't it obvious? Well, you might have thought it said anything that goes on the fire, and none of that ever went on the fire. None of the oil gets burned. Kamash malan, therefore, Yilakol Korbanon comes to teach. So for everything we're going to add here, we're going to have two parts. One is, what are the words coming to teach you? And two is, why wouldn't that have been obvious? Why did you need a drasha to teach us that? L'chol minchatam, l'rabot minchat ha'omer, minchat knaot. L'chol minchatam includes the minchat ha'omer and the minchat knaot. There's what we're looking for, okay? That the remainder goes to the Kohanim. Now, salkadat hachamina v'achlu otam asher kupar b'hem. Now, you might have thought, okay, now this is a pasuk by the Miluim in Shemot, chapter 29, and it says 29:33. It says the Kohanim are going to eat the korbanot, and this is part of the atonement process, is that the Kohanim eat parts of the korban. Okay, this is something unique. Okay, maybe we'll talk about this later as well. Korbanot of Jews are different from korbanot of non-Jews, because, and I mean by non-Jews, soon we're going to talk about korbanot that non-Jews bring in the temple, but I mean in the world around them, what was going on. Korbanot were the typical way that people worship, but usually the items were brought as worship for the gods, as food for the gods. It was viewed as food for the gods, and the gods kind of like eat the food. Okay, one of the differences, if you remember, we never burn our food. Okay, this was helpful on Shabbat and Shul. We started Vayikra, and I was reading Torah Korbanot. It's a book by Yonatan Grossman, an excellent book. And in his intro, he starts talking about these differences, and he highlights and he says, in the non-Jewish world at the time, everything was food. So he gives one example of something we learned. Why, if you remember, you're not allowed to roast the meat before you put it on the fire. Now, he says because we wanted to have a reach nichach. But he says, really, it's part of this whole idea. They would cook their meat before they offered it because it wants to be food ready for the gods to eat. Our food is not for God to eat. Our korbanot is not for God to eat. It's for us to bring it to God, right? Us to show our way of worshiping God, but not for God to eat it. So the eating of the Kohanim is actually part of the completion of the atonement process. Okay, so achlu otam asher kupar b'hem. Now, amar Rachmana, v'hai lahatir ka'atya. Now, this is coming. Now, what do you see here, though? It's for, when do the Kohanim eat? When there's atonement involved in the sacrifice. These two sacrifices, the Korban HaOmer and the Minchat Knaot, are not brought for atoning. Okay, what are they brought for? They're coming, so the Korban HaOmer is lahatir. It's coming to permit the new crop. And idach nami levarer ka'atya, and the other one is coming, the sota, is to establish, is she guilty, is she not? So each has some other purpose that's not for atonement. So maybe you would have thought that those don't get eaten by the Kohanim, which is exactly the source we're looking for. Kamash malan, that's why you have the word l'chol min chatam. There's additional menachot that go to the Kohen that you might have thought don't. Okay, so that ends really our issue, which is, or not our issue, but why we brought this. Because Ravina brought this to say, I have a different source than the one you brought before. Remember, before we have the Chom and Chaballah B'Shem and B'Chariva L'Chob and Aaron Tiyeh, which then we question because we need it for other things. We resolve those questions, so we had that as a source, but here Ravina brings a different source. But since we're in this Braita, we're going to learn the entire Braita, which is going to, as I said, darshan all these two psukim. This one pasuk. L'chol chatatam, so what's that? L'rabot chatat ha'of. If you remember, there's something unique about the sin offering of a bird, which is, instead of normally part goes on the altar and the rest goes to the Kohen, in this case, nothing goes on the altar. The whole thing goes to the Kohen, everything is eaten. Now, what was the issue? Well, you might have thought this is a nevela because you did malika, you didn't do shchita. Malika outside the temple is actually not permitted. If you did malika outside the temple, you wouldn't be allowed to eat the bird. It would be called a nevela. Kamash malan, here comes the teacher. No, you can eat the chatat ha'of even though you only did malika to it. L'chol ashamam, l'rabot asham nazir v'asham tzorah. So what does that come to include? Also the asham of a nazir, also the asham of a tzorah go to the Kohen. So Gemara says, we don't need a pasuk for asham tzorah, it's obvious. Asham tzorah behediktiv be, it says, ki kachatat asham hu la kohen. It says, it's just, the asham is like a chatat, and it goes to the Kohen. So that's a very clear pasuk. It's in the Mitzorah section. very clear. The Asham Matzorah is just like the Chatat. If the Chatat meat, which it says explicitly in the Torah, goes to the Kohen, then obviously the Asham meat. So, Ela l'Rabot Asham Nazir ke Asham Matzorah. So, L'chol Hashamam is coming to say the Asham Nazir is like the Asham Matzorah. What do we have to explain? Why would you have thought it would be different? Well, again, going back to before. You might have thought it's not coming to atone. It's actually coming to permit the Nazir to drink wine. Right? As soon as you bring it, you'll be able to drink wine now. So maybe it's a different type of korban. Doesn't go to the Kohen. Kamash malan. That's why it comes to teach you it does. So now we finish with those 4 words. L'chol korbanam, l'chol minchatam, l'chol chatatam, l'chol hashamam. Okay, each one coming to include. The main one for us was l'chol minchatam. Now, asher yashivu. I said there was this strange section here which says, which they bring to me, which they return to me. What is that? Zeh gezel hager. Okay, if someone steals from a ger and then they go a convert and they go to return it, and let's say the convert has no children that are blood relatives, right? They're from the conversion. So in other words, let's say they convert and they don't have children after that. And they don't have relatives because they're like a katan shenolad. They're like, when they convert, they're new and they have no actual relatives. So what do we do with someone who steals from them and wants to return the money and the person's no longer alive? Now that's why it's yashuvu. Returned stolen item goes to the Kohen. This is not a korban or anything. This is completely different. It's just something that goes to the Kohen. Lecha hiu levanecha, shelcha hiu levanecha, afilu lekadesh bo et isha. Now, because it's not a korban and it's not sanctified, this actually is given to the Kohen. The Kohen can do whatever they want with it. You want to betroth the woman with it, you want to buy milk in the store, whatever you want to do with it, you can do with it. Amar Rav Huna. So that ends the first part of today's daf, which was the 2 drashot, basically, was what we were trying to do. One we saw yesterday of Chizkiah, where we get that, the mincha se'olim, the 2 ones that are with barley, they've gotten nikmas, we took the komets out, and the shirayim become permitted, okay? And the shirayim go to the Kohen. How do we know that? We know that basically, right, you might have thought according to Rabbi Shimon it was different, because there is a precedent where you take a kometz and the shirayim get burnt, and the mincha chotev a Kohen. So how do you know that this is true also for the barley? Either from b'chol mincha b'lu b'shem v'chareva, or from this pasuk, l'chol minchatam. Now, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna is now going to say the following halacha. Now we're going to get to Gentile sacrifices in the temple. So now we're moving to Amud Bet. Shalmeha ovei kochavim olot. If a ovei kochavim comes, a non-Jew comes and says, I want to bring a shlemim, it doesn't get eaten by the owner, okay? It gets burned completely, like an ola. You can either say we're going to learn from a pasuk, or you can say it's just logical. So we're going to start with logic. Ovei kochavim libo l'shamayim. Okay, what does this mean, really? Well, it means when an Ovei Kochavim wants to bring a sacrifice to God, he's not coming to eat meat and let's bring it to God and we'll do part to God, part here. And that's likely for what we were saying, what I was quoting Jonathan Grossman is saying, is that wasn't the culture of Gentiles. Their culture was, you bring something to the God, you bring it as a gift. Totally. Goes to the God. Okay? So if he's coming and he has an intent to bring his heart is with God, meaning he wants to bring a sacrifice to God, he's just going to bring it and offer it to God. That's the way they do sacrifices. Maybe from a pasuk. Asher yakrivu laHashem leolah. Okay, let's read the pasuk. Okay, Deber b'nei Aaron ve'banav, it's in Vayikra chapter 22, verse 18. Deber Aaron ve'banav al kol bnei Israel va'amarta lehem. Okay, the pasuk starts out very clear. It's talking about Aaron, his sons, and the Jewish people. But the next words are ish mi Beit Israel. A man from Beit Israel. Now, this is a little strange because why is it saying ish? And what they're going to darshan later, we're going to see, ish means even a Gentile. Okay, even though it starts off very clearly Jewish, even a non-Jew. Okay, and then it goes off, ger Israel, and a convert in the Jewish people. Asher yakriv korbano lechol nidrehem lechol nidvotam, asher yakrivu Hashem laolah. Okay, so again, we're going to have a whole bunch of words we're going to darshan here. Who will bring his korban for all of his nidarim, all of his nidavot, right? Those are 2 different kinds of voluntary offerings. Asher yakrivu Hashem, which will be sacrificed to God as an olah. So now they're going to say, since the pasuk ish the second ish is referring to non-Jews, and the pasuk ends with Asher yakrivu Hashem laolah, what do we learn from this? Kol demekarve olah lahave. Everything they bring as a sacrifice is an olah. Okay, we're going to have 2 difficulties on this. Mativ Rav Chama bar Guria. This is all a statement of Rav Huna. So Mativ Rav Chama bar Guria, Ovei kochavim shenadev lavish shlamim nitanan li Yisrael ochlan, nitanan l'kohen, kohen ochlan. Wait, Rav Chama Berguria says, listen, this source says, an Ovei Kochavim who brings a voluntary offering, volunteers to bring a shlamim, if he brings it for Yisrael eats it. If he brings it for a Kohen eats it. Sounds like he could bring a shlam and it could be eaten. Now, in this case, it sounds like he decided to give it to someone else to eat, but it could be eaten by them. It's not an ola, and this was a voluntary offering that a Gentile brought. So I'm a Rava Hachikamer. Now, you misunderstood the case. This wasn't a Gentile who was bringing his own sacrifice and decided, you know what, I'm going to give a part of it to the Kohen or to the Yisrael to eat. Then it really would create a difficulty. But it was Al-Menach Yitkaper Bahem Yisrael Achlan. Let's say I had a Gentile friend, knew I wanted to bring a sacrifice to atone, and maybe I couldn't afford it. The Gentile says, I'll pay for it for you. Well, that's the Gentile bringing a korban for me. That's a whole different story. Then I get to eat it. Okay? So if the Gentile's bringing a shlamim on my behalf or on a Kohen's behalf, that's a different story. Then it will get eaten. But if they're bringing it for their own sake, then it doesn't get eaten. So the first problem is resolved. Second problem. Matev Rav Shizbi. Elu menachot nikmetzot u'shayarehen lekohanim minchat goyim. So Rav Shizbi says, look, it says Elu menachot nikmetzot, and their shirayim go to the kohanim. And in that list, this is our Mishnah. What does it say? Minchat goyim. So you see, the mincha of a Gentile, right? The shirayim are eaten by the kohanim. So that seems to be a big, major problem. Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo kashya. Rabbi Yochanan says, don't worry about that. Why not? Ha Rabbi Yossi Aglili, ha Rabbi Akiva. There's two different approaches here. The Mishnah was going by one approach, and Rav Huna was following a different Tanaitic approach. Okay, a different Tanaitic opinion. Let's see who's who. Tanya, and here we're going to bring the Braita where we're going to say this pasuk, and now we're going to darshan this pasuk completely differently. Till now we said Ish is referring to a Gentile, and then it says at the end of the pasuk, Asher krivu l'Hashem la'olah, meaning if the Gentile brings any korban, it's going to be an olah. Now we're going to darshan the pasuk differently. Ish. Okay, well now we'll see the drasha that the other one agreed with, that Ish includes a non-Jew. Matom lomar ish lerabot et havdei kochavim shenodurim nidarim unidavok Yisrael. So havdei kochavim can bring voluntary offerings like a Jew. Asher yakrivu laHashem laolah and liyal olah. Now, if you look at the end of the pasuk, it sounds like maybe they can only bring korbanot olah. Shlamim minayim, where do we get that they could bring shlamim as well? And like I said, we're going to darshan all the words in this pasuk that we saw. Talmud lomar nidrehem. Okay, because it says their vows, that means, if they vow to bring a shlamim. And that sounds like you could just bring a regular shlamim and it gets eaten normally, right? Toda minayim, how do you know they could bring a korban toda? Talmud lomar, because the other opinion was basically saying all they could really bring is an olah. They bring a shlamim, it just is an olah, right? So, now there's actually a debate whether when we say it's an olah, is it an olah, it's really an olah, or it's a shlamim that just gets burnt like an olah gets burnt. But still, we wouldn't really fully say it's like a shlamim. Now, if you say toda minayin, how do we know they can bring a Thanksgiving offering? Talmud lomar nidvotam, because he uses another word to talk about voluntary offerings besides neder, that includes the toda. Minayin lerabot ha'ofot v'hayayim v'halavona v'hayitzim. How do you know birds, wine libations, frankincense offerings, and wood offerings they can bring as well? Talmud lomar nidrehem lechol nidrehem, nidvotam lechol nidvotam. Okay, you have nidrehem, which is plural. So maybe we said before it includes one thing, but we can now say, right, it includes, what did we say? I just blanked for a second. The shlam, right, the shlamim is included with the neder. The nidvotam is including the toda, but now it's plural, and it says lechol, for all. So for each word it says lechol nidrehem or lechol nidvotam. So there you have. We're going to include two additional things for each one. That's going to include the wine, the frankincense, the wood, and the birds. Im kem matam lomar olah. So then why does it say in the end, Asher yakrivu l'Hashem la'olah? That comes to sound a little bit exclusionary. Well, prat l'nizirut. That teaches you, well, the only one korban they can't bring is a nazir korban. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Akiva omer, Asher yakrivu l'Hashem olah, en li olah bilvad. Okay, so there you have it, machloket tanaim. So the Mishnah, which basically said that the mincha v'goy, the shirayim go to the kohen, is because he looks at it, an ovei kochavim can bring all the different types, and it's treated as the different types. According to Rabbi Akiva, he can only bring an olah. There is no such mincha offering. So that would be what Rav Huna holds by, right? That any shlamim of an ovei kochavim is an olah. And that's Rabbi Akiva's position. It just disagrees with our Mishnah, who holds like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Now the Gemara is going to ask just a side question about this last point in the Braita about the Nazir. Wait a minute. You're learning that a non-Jew can't bring a Nazirut from that pasuk, Korban Nazirut, but wait, we learn it from a different pasuk. The pasuk about a Nazir. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem, ish ki afli lindor neder Nazir laHashem. So the pasuk which introduces Nazirut starts off with the words, Daber b'nei Yisrael, and say to them, the Jewish people, and say, a person from among you who wants to be a Nazir. Now, according to this, now this doesn't have ish. It sounds like it's only Jews. And in fact, the drasha is, B'nai Yisrael nodrim ve'ein hovdei kochavim nodrim. It's not just it looks that way, but that's what the drasha on the pasuk is. Okay, the Jewish people can take this vow, but not the Gentiles. There is no Nazirut for Gentiles. Okay, no, not a Nazir within Judaism, right? A Jewish Nazir. Aval Nazirut chala alai. Imehatam. So now this out. Why do you need two psukim for the same thing? Because imehatam, if you just had it from the second, you would have thought, if you just had it from our pasuk, what would you have thought? Korban hu de lo lete aval naziru chalalayu. You might have thought, listen, he can't bring the korban, but he could be a nazir, and he could say, I'm going to be a nazir, I won't drink wine, I won't drink this. He should do the whole process. He just doesn't bring korbanot at the end of the process. Okay? But that's why Kamash Malan, that's why no, there's a Nazirut section starts out and says, no. It's true from the other Pasukah we would learn you don't bring the Korban, but from here you learn you don't even become a Nazir. Okay. The obvious question asked is, well, if you don't become a Nazir, then you don't need our Pasuk about the Korban. The Gemara doesn't go in the other direction. It's a good question why they don't ask that, but I'm going to leave that aside. There are people who address it, but it's a very good, it's a good question. Keman Azlaha, now that we established this machloka between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili about Gentile korbanot, which is a fascinating topic, right? Are they part of the world of korbanot and can bring all sorts of voluntary offerings? Or is it limited just to olas? Okay, or a shlamim is basically treated like an olah, and everything they bring is completely burned. They don't really have minchas, they don't have wine libations, they don't have all the other stuff. Okay, bird offerings. So now they're going to say, Kaman azlaha ditnan. According to who does the following Mishnah go? Okay, Amar Rabbi Shimon. Shiv'ad v'reim itkinu beitim v'zeh achad mehem. Okay, there's 7 things the Beit Din instituted, and this is one of them, and we're going to read only one of them right now. Oved kochavim sheshalach olato lemedinat hayam v'shilach ima nisacheha chevim mishalo. If a Gentile sends his korban olah from abroad and sends money also for, right, he probably just sent money for it, and he sends money for the libations as well. So we use his money for the libations. V'im lav, krevim mishal tzibor. And if not, the community covers the cost. Okay, the Trumat Lishkad does it because you can't have an olah without the libations. But wait, didn't we say Gentiles don't bring libations? They don't bring wine, they don't bring, right, all that stuff. So lema Rabbi Yossi Aglili v'lo Rabbi Akiva. It sounds like this just goes according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says you can bring wine. Because Rabbi Akiva said, no, everything's just an olah. But they say, no. You can explain this according to Rabbi Akiva as well. Afilu tem Rabbi Akiva, olah v'chol chaverata. It's an olah and everything that comes with an olah. The libations are just accessories to the olah. Every time you bring an olah, you need the libations. Of course you bring libations. They just can't bring voluntary libations, but the ones that go with the olah, of course they can bring. And they need to bring. Okay, next source we're going to do the same type of thing with. Man Tana, who's the Tana, Lahad Tana Rabbanan, of this Braita? Which one? Rabbi Yossi Aglili or Rabbi Akiva, or could it be both? Ezrach. Okay, the pasuk here is, Kol Ezrach Yaseh Kacha Et Ele, Lakrivi Sherech Nichach LaHashem. This is in the section by Bamidbar Tefav, where it talks about, right after the Korach story, it talks about bringing libations. So it says, okay, any Ezrach. Ezrach is a citizen, which generally means a Jewish citizen. So Ezrach mevin nisachim ve'eno ve'kochavim mevin nisachim. Okay, it starts off saying very clearly, Gentiles don't bring libations. But then it says, Yachol lo tehe olato tu'una nisachim. You might have thought their olah doesn't need libations. Talmud Lomar kacha. Because it says in the next, the pasuk, 2 psukim before it, kacha yaseh l'shor echad. This is the way it's done. It's always done this way. For a shore, this is how much you bring. For an aisle, this is how much you bring. For a kevis, this is how much you bring. So, or a seb, akvasim ubizim, anyway. So, therefore, his olah needs libations. So now, mani lo Rabbi Yossi Aglili v'lo Rabbi Akiva, it doesn't match either of them. Now you have to realize that at this point they're forgetting, it's as if they didn't see the previous sugya, as if they asked these 2 questions separately, as if you don't know the answer to the previous one. because you'll see in a second they're going to answer part of the difficulty is going to be resolved by the way we answer the previous one. So this seems to match no one. Why? If you go according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, he said you can bring voluntary libations. And obviously you could bring the ones that go with the Ola. And this says you can't bring voluntary ones, only the ones that go with the Ola. Rabbi Akiva, Hamar Ola Imid Yachrini Lo. Right? Rabbi Akiva says they just bring Olot. They don't bring anything else, not the libations. So, Ibai Dema Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Ibai Dema Rabbi Akiva. You can really explain it according to both of them because you could say like this. Ibai Dema Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Smei Me'ahi Yayin. Just remove Yayin off the list of Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. Just say he meant Lavona and wood and birds, but he didn't really say wine. And just remove it because it really makes no sense. Or you could say, Ibait Ema, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Olavachol Chaverata, as we answer the previous difficulty, which is, or the previous kind of suggestion we rejected by saying, what do you mean? Could be Rabbi Akiva requires Ola and everything that goes along with it, so that would include the libations as well. So in the end, these sources could be explained according to both opinions. Okay, now we're going to end with a beginning of a discussion about Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Shimon Omer Minchat Choteh Shel Kohanim, and I say the beginning because we're not going to even really get to Rabbi Shimon yet, but he says the Minchat Choteh of Kohanim, if you remember, you take the komets out, but as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, Tanakama, we're going to say the Shirayim also get burned. Okay, now, Menani Mile, how do we know this? Detana Rabbanan. So a Braita, I'm going to start this Braita today, we'll finish it tomorrow. Vaita LaKohen Kamincha. Okay, let's read this pasuk. First of all, there's two pasukim you really need to know here. One is Vayikra chapter 5, verse 13. V'chiper alav kohen al chatato asher chata me'achat me'eleh v'nislach lo v'ayta lakohen kemincha. Okay, we're talking about the korban olev yored here, and we're in chapter 5 of Vayikra where it talks about the olev yored korban, and it says there that if you bring the mincha offering, it atones for the kohen is going to atone for the sin asher chata me'achat me'eleh, from one of the following sins of the Olav Yored. If you remember, there's a whole list of possible sins that the Olav Yored, the sliding scale offering, comes for. V'nislach lo v'ayta lakohen kamincha. Okay, he's forbidden. And, it's a little bit weird, this will be for the kohen like a mincha. Okay, we're not really sure what that means. Okay, now the other thing you need to know is, there's a pasuk that talks about, in the Mincha Chavitin, in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 16, okay, again, for those following Parshat Shavua, these are great because we're dealing with it in these, right, between last week and this week, we're getting to all these sections. Chol minchat kohen kalil tiyeh lo te'achel. Any mincha of a kohen gets burned completely. Okay? Lo te'achel, it doesn't get eaten. So now, that's really talking about a voluntary offering of a kohen. But, and we're talking about a sin offering, we're talking about the Olav Yored. So let's see what the Braita is going to do here. So what does it mean by Vayta lakohen kamincha? Shetehei avodata kshera bo. That the avodah, if what it means, Vayta lakohen kamincha, that let's say you're the kohen who'd sinned and needs to bring the Olav Yored and you can't afford the other ones, so you bring a mincha. You can do your own korban. Okay, you can be the korban to do your own, bring your own korban in the altar. And so it means avodata kshera bo, and the kohen who needs it. Ata omer shetehei avodata kshera bo. Maybe it's coming to say the mincha choteh of kohanim is allowed to be eaten by the kohanim. Then what would I do with that pasuk? If I went along that way and I said it means the kohanim can eat the remainder, even if it's a kohen's mincha, well then what would I do with that pasuk that says all the minchas of kohanim get burnt? So, which again is a nidava, is a voluntary, but they would say minchat nidvato aval chovato te'ne'echelet. Maybe you would say, no, that's his nidava. But his chova, as obligatory one, could be eaten. Talmud lomar, vayta lakohen kamincha. That's why it says it's for the kohen kamincha, makish chovato lenidvato. Ma nidvato ena ne'echelet, af chovato ena ne'echelet. Just like the nidava isn't eaten, the voluntary offering of a kohen, also the sin offering of a kohen doesn't get eaten. Okay, and that's to teach you it doesn't get eaten. Comes Rabbi Shimon and he says, we'll only start this right now. Amar Rabbi Shimon, v'china amar, hayta lekohen kim. By the way, from the end of that first section of the Braita, it seems like we're actually getting two things. Vayta lemincha, right? Vayta mincha lekohen is really teaching you, vayta lekohen kamincha is really teaching you the kohen himself can do the avoda, and it's teaching you that that really it's like a nedava in the same way that it doesn't get eaten. Okay, now comes. One second. So now they say, so comes Rabbi Shimon and says, V'china amar v'ayta l'kohen kim minchato. Hello, lo ne'emar ela kim mincha. So first he rejects the beginning part. He says, what do you mean? It doesn't say like his mincha, meaning it could be his own mincha. No, it just says kim mincha. So that's coming for something else, which we're going to see in tomorrow's daf. We'll have to stop here because our daf ends here. So let's just review. We started with the source for Rabbi Shimon, that for barley, also the Kohanim get the remainder. And we saw for the pasuk, V'chom Chabula B'Shem B'Chareva. We said, doesn't that pasuk isn't needed for other things? We found two other things this actually teaches, but we were able to learn each one from different words or different parts of the word, and therefore we were okay. We had the Vichol and Kol, and that resolved our issue. Then we got to end the V'chom Chabula B'Shem and all that. Then we said Ravina brings a different source for the barley, and that was the word lechol min chatam, and then we got into his whole braita about all the different things he darshed. And then we got to Rav Huna, who talked about the shlamim and ovei kochavim as the ola, which we then learned was actually a debate. The reason why we got to Rav Huna was because they brought a difficulty on him from our Mishnah. And we said, yeah, because our Mishnah follows a different position. He follows one position, the Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position. And then we got into the machloka between the two of them. And then we started this last section, right, and all sorts of sources. Do they match only Rabbi Akiva, only Rabbi Yossi Aglili in this machloket? And then we went on to Rabbi Shimon's opinion about burning the shirayim also, and we're going to see where the source for this is. By the way, I just wanted to point out one thing here. What we saw about the rabbi's position, I forgot to stress this, which is in the rabbi's position here, the Tanakama, they also say that mincha kohen is not eaten, but but their assumption is there's no kamitza taken. You just burn the whole thing. It's just like the voluntary one. The voluntary one, you don't take a kometz out, separate the kometz, and then burn the kometz and the shirayim. That's something unique that Rabbi Shimon has here specifically for the minchachote. According to the rabbi's position, you basically just burn the whole thing. Okay, it's not like the kometz is taken out, it seems like. So we're going to get to there, right? So according to, and again, I just want to remind you, the mincha chote was mentioned by Tanakam in the Mishnah, but that's a mincha chote of Yisrael. The mincha chote of a Kohen, according to at least Tanakama here in this Braita, thinks that the whole thing gets burned. Rabbi Shimon's going to say it's true it gets burned, but it gets burned in parts. We're going to take the kometz out also. Okay, and that we'll get to in tomorrow's daf, what his source is and where he gets it from the pasuk. With that, we're wishing everyone a good day and a safe day. Shnishma b'sorot tovot.